like finding really cool people that are doing really cool work and putting them into conversation, and for just the purpose of like that, and also like building some amount of community, and yeah, just like strengthening relations across campus, and also like seeing what comes from it. So before we're online, so yeah, we've been doing, this was one of the dean's grants is where it started. So it was really like thinking about like transdisciplinarity, like what it is. We were thinking about justice with regard to that. So and thinking like really broadly around like just transitions. Now we're thinking more along the lines of just transformations, same, you know, similar, but a little bit more structurally complete potentially with the transformation. But we wanted to bring you all together just because you do different work on like governance in different ways and like thinking about it in different ways, and thought it'd be awesome just to have you in conversation. So it is like very low stakes intentionally. It's more about like conversation, coming together, sharing perspective. Hello. And then yeah, and then just seeing what comes from that. So I think you each have like roughly 10-ish minutes, 12 minutes or so, like if you want to like share thoughts, and then we kind of like open it up for conversation. Does that sound good? That's good. Awesome. Just wanted to, I think we communicate. I think I hope, hopefully like communicated that in the email, but also wanted to like come back to it just really quickly. Sweet. Awesome. And then Paola is gonna, she's our MC and gonna lead us off and do everything.
Yeah.
Like drive the ship is what I mean, like coordinate us all.
So yeah, thank you for the introduction to JSET. I would like to start by introducing the presenters today. So Ed is an assistant professor from the Department of Human Dimensions of Natural Resources at CSU. He is an environmental social scientist with an interest in biodiversity conservation research from an interdisciplinary perspective, drawing on ecology and political science. He also has a passion for migratory animals, particularly shorebirds and ungulates. Lauren Gifford, who is also here, is the interim director of the Soil Carbon Solutions Center at CSU, and also a faculty from the Department of Ecosystem Sciences and Sustainability. She is a human environmental geographer, and her work explored the intersections of climate change policy, conservation markets, and justice. And Tamee Albrecht is an assistant professor at the Department of Ecosystem Sciences and Sustainability. She is a human environment geographer focusing on environmental governance, climate change adaptation, and water governance, and interactions aimed on water, energy, and food resources. And her work occurs at multiple scales in urban to transboundary context. Thank you so much, you three, for being here. And yeah, I don't know, like, who would like to start? It's like,
do you want to throw out a question for us, and then we can, or is it just talking about governance?
Yeah. Are we recording as well?
Yeah.
Oh, sweet. Awesome. Cool. Yeah. Nice. And welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. Yeah, so as we were kind of talking about earlier, is just thinking about how each of you does work in a lot of different areas and ways, but also thinking about your work in governance. And so like that was kind of like, as we try to draw people into conversation, so it could be like governance in the political ecology sense, or with migratory species, thinking about water. It doesn't have to just be focused in like Latin America, but like just thinking through these things. And so like, I guess a two-part question, or just like an open kind of like thing to begin thinking with would be like, do you ever think about transdisciplinarity? I'll be honest, I hadn't thought a lot about it before like these seminars and like before like really like starting to think through it, but it's been something that I think has been like really productive as a way to think about how we do our research, how we come together with people. And if you do think about transdisciplinarity, like how might you think about governance within that? And if that's too onerous of a question, then like, what do you do? Tell us a bit about your work on governance, and then we can move toward like thinking about transdisciplinarity after that. If that makes sense. So leave it to you to do it however you like.
Also, it's just funny. I just see so many overlaps between U of A.
Like all three
of us,
right?
University of Arizona, CU Boulder, geography.
Like
there's a lot of overlap. I don't know like where you went to school, but I do think there's going to be sort of lines in the discourse just from like our disciplinary roots and how we come to think about things like governance.
Totally.
Yeah, I was not trained anywhere around the US Southwest or the Front Range. So yeah, I did my PhD in Australia, yeah, in Brisbane. So I kind of came like into this like the other way around, like not from a disciplinary training per se, a disciplinary interest, but from a normative interest, I guess, of like being trained originally as a biologist and trying to understand the international dimensions that were required for conserving migratory species, basically. And in particular, this is like now like zooming out, how I started thinking about, well, maybe thinking about migratory shorebirds is too specific. So how can I zoom out to, you know, do work that is a little bit more impactful and probably not, you know, it's just so much you can do about shorebirds. I mean, there's lots of work to be done, but I mean, it's hard to keep doing just like something so specific. So it was the other way around. I started first like working on migratory shorebirds, and then I started zooming out thinking, well, how else I can conceptualize migratory shorebirds beyond like the birds themselves. And then that's where I started landing in that kind of space where I thought like, well, maybe I can start thinking about them more broadly as migratory species, more broadly. And then what I found very quickly, and here I'm spilling some beans, is the fact that in the governance literature, migratory species have been recognized for a long time as an example of a transboundary problem, but very few people have really studied the dimensions, the governance dimensions of migratory species. And what I'm saying is that it's not that there is a dearth of governance practice when it comes to migratory species. There is a lot of governance practice, but very little scholarship. So when you compare to, for instance, water governance or climate governance, yeah, like most people, I mean, you know, that work in governance, I mean, at least in the international space, kind of has become like a synonym, right? Like global environmental governance and climate governance in many ways. Yeah, and migratory species, both theoretically and empirically, have received very little attention. And my initial work was in the Asia Pacific, looking at the system of international agreements and transboundary arrangements for conserving migratory shorebirds in the Asia Pacific, which migrate anywhere between Alaska, Russia, all the way down to New Zealand and Australia. And yeah, and interestingly, those tiny birds that do not seem to be so appealing have attracted a lot of political attention, and they have, you know, very prominent figures, you know, political figures have rallied for their conservation. So that was my initial work, and I am very interested in the questions of social ecological fit. And I think we are in a very interesting, living very interesting times, because now there is a plethora of, they're like the 2.0 of animal tracking and understanding migrations. Like now the resolution at which we understand now migration is like so detailed, both in time and space. And a lot of that literature is coming from ecologists, but they don't, to my view, they don't know what to do with that. They produce all these beautiful maps with lots of lines that are amazing and blow our minds. But to me, that's like begging, like, please, social ecological fit analysis, you know, because all what you need to do now is boom, overlap the institutional dimensions, and then you can do amazing analysis. So I think there is a lot of opportunities for very cool integration of ecologically spatial explicit data with institutional and governance data, which is very cool. So in the case of the Asia Pacific, what I looked mostly was at the architecture of the structural, well, I mean, in Ostrom words, polycentricity, but, you know, I more come from the international environmental governance literature, so more regime complex, but, you know, to me, that's potatoes in many ways.
We can go to a conference where it's not potato.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
right, Ostrom.
Yeah. I mean, Ostrom also kind of started, you know, like taking her polycentricity to understand the international, right? And the regime complexity kind of speaks to the same, right? Of how transboundary issues are not governed by only one agreement, but by multiple, right? Or multiple loci of decision making and governance. And so I studied that, and then the social ecological fit, and then I did my postdoc at UW in Seattle, and I looked at kind of similar questions as what I'm going to be sharing today about the emergence and what explains the emergence of the system of governance, of the transboundary governance system for shorebird conservation in the Americas, because these birds do the same. They migrate from the very north where they breed, and they go all the way down to Patagonia. So what is very cool about these birds is that it kind of almost provide like a replicates, because they migrate all over the world, kind of in quite defined areas, more or less, discrete regions. And the emergence of the systems of governance are very different between or across places. So that's what I would present today, is how that emerged. And now I'm just interested in basically branching out to other groups. So now I'm interested in migratory ungulates, and I have a student who is studying a project next year next year in Wyoming, looking at pronghorn, migratory pronghorn, conservation governance. Yeah, and I'm very interested in all the questions that integrate ecological data, especially social-ecological fit, but also questions of historical institutionalism, how institutions come about, and what explains that they emerge or that they don't emerge, or how they end up being, basically. Yeah, that's in a nutshell. Yeah.
Very cool.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah. Tam, do you want to go down?
Just a background of.
Sure, yeah, thinking about governance or background, thinking about transdisciplinarity. I think you've been thinking about that one a little bit, but either which way, like. Mhm.
Doing it is more difficult.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, so my focus is on water governance primarily, as well as environmental governance. And kind of, yeah, multiple scales. So a lot of my work is at the transboundary international scale, looking at kind of global frameworks for water governance and transboundary agreements and organizations at the transboundary level, institutions, and kind of how those are designed, how they function, how they adapt when needed to kind of changing conditions. And then another portion of my work, I guess, is at more of a local level, looking at water supply organizations. And so I'm really interested in kind of the function of organizations, how these organizations are making decisions when needing to respond to stressors, population growth, climate change, really anything kind of socio-environmental stressors. And kind of at those two different scales. So looking at the internal organizational dynamics, and then also like the external institutional environment and how that influences the choices that organizations are making and how they're kind of balancing multiple needs. So that's kind of, yeah, a brief overview.
Awesome, thank you.
So I'm Lauren Gifford, and I'm at the Soil Carbon Solutions Center, but I'm a human environment geographer, as Paula said, and I identify as a political ecologist. And I particularly focus on climate and carbon governance, I draw my research questions from the sort of roots of political ecology that say how and by whom. So how is the governance enacted and by whom, and who's excluded and included from those sort of creations. And I think one of the reasons why I'm really drawn to this space, and I think that this space is really important, and if there's any philanthropists in this room, you should give us all money.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Right? Because I think we can't decouple the human from the environmental systems. And oftentimes governance tries to do that. So I did my PhD in the same program that Joel did, and then I did a really special postdoc with the Earth Commission, where I was on the Earth System Governance Working Group, where we thought about what is necessary and what are the necessary components for just transformations. I've written whole papers about the difference between transitions and transformations. And transformations we like to think about, or transformations we think about as sort of multiple and simultaneous transitions. And when we think about the enabling qualities for just transformation, a lot of it is fostering and supporting human health and well-being. So strong autonomous people in democratic spaces can create strong environmental support systems in whatever that looks like. So I think about like CSU right now. We're told to sort of, the president's focus areas are democracy and climate, and I'm sure there's another one, but like those two things are inextricably linked, right? You can't have viable climate solutions without a strong democratic populace. And I guess, what am I thinking about here? Oh yeah, so one thing where I'm taking my research now is what happens when we have people who are seeking to just accumulate capital as really driving the dominant discourse in how we address climate change. We know that climate change in itself is a crisis of capitalism. So what happens when sort of mega capitalists become the voice and the fiscal sponsors of climate action? Is that the right way? And will we have results that actually matter? So anyway, I'm excited to hear what everyone else here has to say. I'm excited to be in a room with social scientists. and my modeler colleague over here in the red shirt. But yeah, I'm just, yeah, throw out some questions. I'm just like so excited to hear about you two. It's so different.
So yeah, and thank you all very much. So we're all coming at like governance from different perspectives, different kind of like traditional or disciplinary backgrounds and trainings. We being the three of you, and perhaps others in here as well. Given like the focus on transdisciplinarity as well, broadly speaking, and like we've been grappling with it over time. Like, I totally get it. Like, if you don't have like in your mind like a take on it, but if you do, like, what do you like? What does that like evoke for you? Like, what does that mean? Is it just kind of like a reframing of like participatory research type things? Does it ostensibly do something different? Think about it a lot, hard to do in practice, you know, like very true. Love to hear your thoughts on that. So just like thinking a little bit about like, what do y'all think? Like, how do you approach transdisciplinarity? Do you approach it in your work? And like, what kind of thoughts might you share about that? Like the promise, potential, peril, all those types of things. Because there is like in this college in particular, there's like a focus on it. I think it's neat to have that as a focus, but it's also, there is a challenge. It's like, how do you actually do that? Paola and I are doing a lot of like readings on it right now as well. And so like thinking as well about like the way in which like those challenges are actually manifest in the practice. So just would love to hear like your thoughts on that, like, and how you might come to that in your work.
I think one of the challenges and sort of the mandates for folks engaging in transdisciplinary work is that you really need to know your discipline quite well to sort of be a thought leader in your space, but then you need to be able to speak about it in a way that makes sense to other people. And I know when I'm around, like, as soon as I get around Joel, I'm like, okay, if I say capitalism, do I need a whole paragraph after explaining whose capitalism I'm talking about, right? But when you take that same idea to a much more transdisciplinary group that's trying to accomplish something, you might just say market flows or flows of capital, right? Like, we need to be able to explain what we're talking about to everyone else, not just people who've read the same books as us.
I think that kind of shared language thing is really important, and I'm going to the point of thinking about transdisciplinarity and then what does it look like in practice. I just feel like it's a whole different ballgame. It's a legwork in and of itself to do the interactions in a certain way, to create a shared language, to kind of have this understanding, to bridge these boundaries. And that in and of itself is kind of a whole separate thing from maybe the research that you're trying to accomplish. Feels like a very layered process to me. And I wonder sometimes if kind of doing this different process within a context where we're kind of having the same maybe professional goals is inappropriate. Like maybe we need to change what those outputs are, what those goals are, because if we're changing the process, then, you know, are those goals still appropriate, or should they be shifted to match better?
Yeah, I find interdisciplinary, which are we using those terms interchangeably for the
inter and trans?
Yeah,
no,
for the purpose of our reach or of our talk today.
Yeah, we're trying to think specifically on the trans.
On the
like
trans,
how it might be
okay.
different.
What is the difference? Do we know?
I have a take, but I'm not in the hot seat right now.
Okay, all right.
It's more cross-sectoral, right? The transdisciplinary, right? Because it expands beyond academia, right? It goes to other sectors. Is that what we are talking about, right?
Totally.
Yeah, as opposed to interdisciplinary, which is still within the bounds of academia, right? Yeah. I find, I mean, I don't know. I can speak more to interdisciplinary than transdisciplinary. I think transdisciplinary is like another level, especially because incentives are very different. But I think for interdisciplinary, I think universities, I think the Warner College is very well placed for that because it embraces right off the bat, like institutionally, that interdisciplinarity. But for instance, when I did my PhD, I was advised against integrating into my work political science. Like I was going to look at the governance dimensions of migratory species conservation. And I thought, well, I need to start off by understanding, international relations theory, that's like first step, and political theory like more broadly, and I was advised against it, you know, because the department where the center where I was on conservation, and it was housed by the Department of Biology. So they told me like, don't waste your time going, you know, that's why we are in separate buildings. Well, that's why I don't like this, you know, and I'm not gonna listen to you, and I'm gonna do my thing, you know, and I ended up doing it. So I think one thing is that you definitely need to embrace like the paradigms from different disciplines. And I think that's very difficult to do, but I think you can do it, right? To embrace the paradigms. And then secondly, to me, is that unlike in disciplinary research, what you do in interdisciplinary research, to me, that you open up the black box of both of different fields empirically and analytically, which I think sometimes that's why like the government literature on migratory species remains, you know, not disciplinary, because even though they are dealing with migratory species, it's not that they are dealing with migratory species, what makes it integrating them, the ecology. If they don't integrate the ecology, you have to open up the black box of what it means ecologically, that you are dealing analytically with migratory species, and same with climate change. Unless you open up the black box, you are not really doing interdisciplinary research. So I think that means that you need to integrate different methods, different paradigms. And then thirdly, I would say that a very big challenge in interdisciplinary research is your publication venues.
Yeah.
Because different journals are going to expect different angles on how you frame your contribution, and getting that recognition is very hard. And even if you get past that, when it comes to reviewers, it's very difficult, because oftentimes what happens with my research is that I kind of see it clearly that they send it very purposefully to an ecologist and to a governance person. And then the results that come from that review are very mixed, because a lot of what I think is very significant of my contribution from a governance perspective for the ecologists is like, so what? Like, I don't care about the results, you know, I don't see the significance. So I think to make it, you know, to get your message across is a challenge. But I think that, you know, that journals like Regional Environmental Change, Global Environmental Change, to me, those kind of journals kind of hit the sweet spot. For instance, even though I'm primarily a conservator, I call myself a conservationist. A lot of the conservation journals still are way too heavy on the natural science side of traditions, so much that one paper that we got published some years ago, we included a conceptual framework, and they told us, oh, we don't do that. We're like, well, but Mark Berman, you know, the editor-in-chief, had just said recently that they were going to expand to be more interdisciplinary. So how is that they are expanding to be more interdisciplinary if they are not adopting and embracing the traditions from different disciplines, you know? So it's a challenge. I think it's definitely a challenge, but I think it's very rewarding, very exciting. So yeah.
Yeah, so I think like one of the things that like drew me to academia, I think I can speak for you as well, is like wanting to affect like change, like actually like do something, right? Like make things happen, do something in different ways. I was interested in, yeah, I guess so, like going back to the University of Arizona, I was involved in the Bureau of Applied Research and Anthropology. So it's like very much like applied research, working long-term with communities. Like language is about like community-based participatory or like action research and those types of things. So learning about that. And I guess the point of bringing that up is like thinking about like how we affect change in our work and how we, to your point, like, how do we communicate?
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like
right.
that to me is like some like one of the most fundamental and basic, and you also brought that up, like how do we actually like communicate with people? How do we build processes to like find shared knowledge? Like those boundary objects and things like that we read about in seminar, like how do we like find those boundary objects where there's like common ground, some shared understanding, but then like enough difference that like it becomes this thing that we mobilize around. And then like, as well as like, is that actually aligned? So like, are those commitments to like affecting change truly aligned with like what we do in our work? Or is it really just like this extra thing that you're kind of supposed to do, but it's really just the same thing that you always do, and it's never like, if you really do that more engaged work, that it detracts from that. So I guess, and to your point as well, like I think you're in different buildings for an obvious reason, right? You know, so like it's like that is very much like, to me, like an embodiment of that, like the disavowal of like thinking about like synthesis. But like why then do you find like importance in doing that kind of work? Like like the communication, why do you find importance in like trying to push these kinds of things in your own work?
I mean, I think one reason is otherwise you're in an echo chamber with just people who studied your discipline, which doesn't mean that they studied your content area, right? Or your geographic area. The other thing is like to actually do stronger research, right? Like we always say, diversification minimizes risk in agriculture. Diversification minimizes risk in ideas and, in processes. But looking into sort of the political ecology and the Marxism that we come from, there's like huge power dynamics, right? So if you are doing, and to actually be successful in transdisciplinary work, you need to forfeit some power and share that power. So just because you come in a room with a PhD or whatever, or a master's degree and say, I've been studying this, I've been to the field, I've da. So what? Like those people, everyone else in the room has just as much life experience as you, and that's just as valuable. It might just not be packaged in the same way. And I think relinquishing some of that power, and also sharing the resources that we have as academics, because many of the people that we would work with as transdisciplinary scholars don't have those same resources. Like, sure, we don't have the resources of the private sector, but we have a lot of resources. When my first job out of my master's was running a climate justice research project at Dartmouth College, and we were funded by the Ford Foundation, and my boss turned best friend, Michael Dorsey, had said, your job is just to help all these civil society groups. You like sit down, you shut up, you bring snacks, you book conference rooms, you book conference calls. That's your job. And, as like a 20-something, I was like, I have a master's degree from Dartmouth. Shut up, right? Sit down, shut up, bring snacks. And I think like that's still a lot of what I think about as my like role in certain spaces, is like, how can I be of service as much as how can I share what I've learned?
I'd just say personally, I think that just based on my training, I guess I have an interest in looking at things from different perspectives. I have a master's degree in hydrology, so very much from the physical science side, coming into the social science side, and just wanting to continue to kind of use that interdisciplinary lens when I look at issues. I would say also being trained as a geographer, I feel like crossing disciplines and like thinking about different literatures is just kind of inherent in that. And also the kind of foundational question or feature of the context of the problem being so much something that needs to be considered and trying to understand it, that understanding that local context just calls for this kind of interactive, engaged, transdisciplinary approach, continually kind of looking across contexts and kind of doing comparative work, just, begs for that kind of mode of analysis.
This is such a good PR session for geography.
Yeah, definitely. It is.
Become a geographer.
And that's the secret. That's the secret.
Well, one of the slogans is geography is what geographers do. Like geography is everything and anything, and
which is a challenge, but also exciting. Yeah.
And I think like going back to I don't know if I don't want to overstep if you're going to say something.
No.
Okay. I think like going back to your point, like part of one of the questions I heard you say about like what is transdisciplinarity like versus interdisciplinarity. That was like, as we started this kind of like our series of conversations, and Andrea is not here today. She's in Bolivia actually doing work with partners. So she would normally be here. And when I say like we, especially like Andrea and I, it was like thinking about that question, you know what I mean? So like, what is that? What is the difference? Is this just like a meta? And like Ryan Fincham from the Center for Protected Area Management, he's been involved in this for a long time as well, in this kind of group and thinking of it, but like they only work with practitioners. They train like folks that are going out to like work on protected areas. It could be like rangers. It could also be like indigenous peoples. They do like Spanish and Portuguese language training. So they're like thinking about like applying science or taking lessons and like just very practical and like meaningful change, And so like, is this just like some sort of like meta interdisciplinarity or some like ridiculous discourse to like do nothing other than just call it something different? And like, I think the difference though is supposed to be, and to your point, is like seeding power, like thinking about co-production, whatever that word means, but like thinking about like actually like coming together with folks outside of academia to produce some sort of like new knowledge. And so that process like looks different in different ways, like of like co-designing projects, or like, you know, like how does that actually like unfold? But then also hopefully like meeting some sort of like broader interest outside of just these silos. So like at University of Arizona as well, like working with Tracy Osborne, she had a group called the Public Political Ecology Lab. And so like, it was kind of like, we never used the word transdisciplinarity, but it was like the same, it was very similar, like kind of goal of like, what do like community organizations want? Like, how do we actually like use these tools to do things that matter for people other than just like writing papers, you know what I mean? And same with like BARA, the Bureau of Applied Research and Anthropology at Arizona. Is a kind of a similar, they never use that language. It's a different discourse, but similar kind of like goals in some ways. Yeah.
So one of the things that we think about a lot in the carbon governance space is what community benefits look like in carbon development. And when you see a sort of market agreement, they always say, and you have to check this box for community benefits. Are there community benefits agreements that are articulated? But what quickly has become apparent is that a lot of times carbon development is happening in places that don't have governance structures that reflect sort of global North democratic understandings of how people are organized, right? So there might be an ejido in southern Mexico that land is communally owned. What does the distribution of benefits look like? So a lot of times the scholars in the climate governance space get stuck up in like, is there distribution of benefits? But actually where these things get hung up is like, or, you know, what are the benefits? Because sometimes the benefits are like, we'll build you a school or a medical clinic as long as you stop cutting down any single tree that, you know, the Conservation International tells you not to cut down. Or the benefits are like, well, this will go to sort of small cash payments will go to your community. One that I saw recently was subsistence farmers were asked to stop growing diversified 1 hectare food in their community to specifically grow cashew plants for sale. But this was not a community that was really integrated with markets at all. And then one of the benefits was job creation. These were also not people who work jobs, right? Like they live in a subsistence collective community. So I think in a place where transdisciplinary scholarship can help us to say these are problems that are just creating other problems by deploying Western market mechanisms as a solution to climate change, when they aren't recognizing the unique characteristics of place and community where they are deployed. So anyway, just made me think of that when we think about, you know, as like an example of what you're talking about. And then how do you get a lot of times the funders of these projects who are big oil or big tech, how do you get them to respond to the fact that they aren't recognizing or engaging with local needs in the right way, or in a way that's actually effective to the people who are impacted, who are doing the labor to create the carbon credits in the first place, right? They're changing their behavior to create capital that can then be traded on markets, but what they're getting in return isn't something that's useful or can be additionally problematic.
And so like thinking with what you just put down as well, it brought us also back to like the idea of governance. And so considering that kind of like great, very grounded example and thinking about like transdisciplinarity and how we've been talking about it and coming back to all y'all's different and distinct work on governance, like how do you see the relationship, or do you see a relationship or a role that like your perspective on governance has to like thinking about how you might do or move forward some sort of like transdisciplinary work approach in your work? Or like rethinking some of what you do from that, would that be valuable or of like a thought experiment of use?
Yeah, I think crossing disciplines to me is so exciting because at the end of the day, I mean, what I found is that because conservation, I mean, as a discipline really came originally from biological science. So but the normative imperative is is one that is very clear, and is conserving biodiversity. So so-called conservation biologists took whatever they could to advance that goal without realizing that very quickly they started stepping out of biology from a disciplinary perspective, and they started stepping into territories that would belong to the social sciences, because they were studying they were dealing with social phenomena, not with biological phenomena anymore. But I think many of them didn't recognize it. And what I have found is that conservation biologists have reinvented lots of wheels, and not better than the ones that were created by social scientists. So I believe that, failing to recognize the other conceptual spaces where you can find a better place for you to understand your empirical case, so to speak, I think is very important. And now thinking about that transdisciplinarity, a lot has to do, to me, with what are your normative paradigms. And I think that's something that to me comes very clear when I talk about, for instance, when I talk about all these issues with political scientists are always concerned with power, with justice, with distribution, with allocation. None of that is intrinsically an imperative from a normative perspective for a conservation biologist. And that's why they went on kicking out people from areas to create national parks, in practice. Because they dismiss all that. They were all for one objective, with what's protecting biodiversity, no matter what, So the imperative is very clear from that perspective. And I think to integrate those two, or to find ways where you can integrate the different normative paradigms from different disciplines or different sectors, I think is quite a challenge. Yeah. And that's what I find a lot. Like when I present my work with conservation biologists, all what they are trying to get at is like, okay, how can this improve conservation? How can this inform the process to be more effective? And that's not the question for a political scientist. Yeah, they are not so concerned, right, with whether the species are going to go extinct or not. They're interested in other questions. So yeah.
When you talk about normative paradigms, we've talked about like organizing principles and common language. It makes me think of targets. And targets like 1.5 degrees or 350 parts per million. These numbers become a tool for a shared language, but they also become an organizing principle around which to establish governance. And how, I just think like when we see numbers like this, we need to be cautious of like, what work do they do? Again, another sort of political ecology, critical geography question, what work do they do? But so they have a lot of power because then we design governance around them, right? Like, how are we going to manage the atmosphere in a way that keeps us below 2 degrees Celsius, increase, whatever. So I think when we talk about governance, we also really need to talk about these targets that become governing principles, and that sort of that we think are, like, how the hell do we know the city of Boulder, where I live, is like, how do we know that what they're doing is going to help us stay under 2 degrees, right? But that becomes the language by which they talk about their governance and behavior changes. So I think, I just think we can't overlook the power of targets.
We want to leave time for other folks in the room to ask questions and that, but I don't know if any of you have any other kind of like thoughts that you want to share before we open it up more broadly.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear from everyone else in there.
Shall we?
And online.
Yeah.
Hi, Megan. Hi, Margaret.
Oh yeah, we have some people in chat too.
Cool, that's great. So we have some time for some questions. I just want to make sure that we have time for the questions, because we often go long. So instead of going long, we're gonna like keep it kind of like. So what do y'all think?
You talk about power dynamics, right?
Maybe introduce yourself too, so that they get to know who you are.
I'm Clara, candidate in the ecology program, and also trying to integrate transdisciplinarity into my research. And that's actually related to the question, right? Because you talk about power dynamics in terms of we as researchers go into a community, and how do you present yourself? Do you present from, I'm the knowledgeable here versus share it versus everybody has a valuable perspective, and maybe I should shut up and listen. In your research, this is for all of you, there are power dynamics in the universities too, and structures that are very vertical, right? And expectations about disciplinary areas and publication. So what's your experience with that? What's your experience as faculty members, researchers challenging those structures with your research, right? In terms of publication, for example, or in terms of how you teach, in terms of the relationship that you have with your PhD students, for example, what's your experience with that? Have you tried to challenge those structures, and do you think other perspectives or other structures that are more horizontal would benefit transdisciplinarity within academia, and how we approach that? What are your takes on that?
I think there's a benefit for really going in deep as a graduate student, because that'll get you really far later, going really deep in your discipline. But also, like, go to your conferences, whatever your disciplinary conferences, and make friends outside your university. The network that I have of fellow geographers who, again, have like done the same readings as me, but that people that I met at the American Association of Geographers or the Political Ecology Conference, they sort of carry you throughout your whole career, and they'll support you throughout your whole career. So I think there's a real value in sort of meeting other ecologists as, and there's also a real value in being able to talk to other ecologists about ecology, even if it's too siloed for where you want to take your career. I don't know, I'll let you guys have more PhD students than me. I just have Megan.
I agree with that. I went to, as a PhD student, I went to SISINC in Maryland, the Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, and a lot of what they focus on is this interdisciplinary kind of work, and kind of the process of doing that. Like, how do you really do that and do it well? And I just remember being kind of surprised that the very first thing that they had everyone do was define yourself within your discipline, and kind of contribute. And I was like, what are we doing? You know, we're here to kind of do this interdisciplinary thing, but they're really kind of focusing on this rooting in your discipline, and how that kind of allows you then to contribute in interdisciplinary spaces, and to kind of have that cross-disciplinary interaction. That rooting is so important in terms of perspective and your foundation that you bring to this kind of conversation. Found that really interesting.
Yeah, my case, I don't know. I mean, I definitely had a little bit of that from one of my PhD supervisors when I was doing my PhD, one of my advisors. But then I found a very nice place, a very sweet spot in between having a political geographer, one of my main advisors, and I'm a spatial ecologist and conservationist. So it was a very nice relationship. And to be honest, yeah, I mean, I kind of see where you're coming from with your comments and your questions, but I think that's why I'm at HDNR, I think, and very happily. Yeah, because, you know, it allows me to do what I want to do, how I want to do it, you know? So I don't see that I struggle with power dynamics or with those sort of expectations, you know, as on like where I should be more in one discipline or another one, you know? I don't feel that people raise eyebrows, right? Because I am not completely clearly defined within a discipline, right? Or because I jump or bounce back a little bit between different things. I don't feel that we belong within that very traditional, you know, path of a scholarship. Now for students, for advisees, I think that's a challenge. I mean, to pass that on to advisees, I think, because there's so much you can do. And if somebody doesn't want to take it and has maybe more interest in a particular discipline than the other one, or maybe just, you know, it's very hard with advisees, I would say, to really foster that interdisciplinary, unless they truly, you know, want to do it. But, you know, you cannot force it. So they end up doing, you know, whatever they want, you know, and you have just to support them, I guess.
One last thing on that is that I encourage you to lean into who you are, but also like, you gotta get through your PhD, right? So like, do what it takes to get to that end game, but that's just the start of your career. And if you really lean into who you are, other people will be receptive to that and pick it up. Like, I didn't have a great time in grad school. And I've had a great time since I walked across that stage and took my diploma, because now I can really be who I am. But you know, just by the nature of the shackles of grad school.
There is a book by E.O. You know E.O. Wilson, the book, and I think probably the one that I enjoyed the most. I mean, because as a conservationist, I don't like E.O. Wilson as a conservationist. As a biologist, it's a different story. Of course, he's great, but not as a conservationist. But there's a book called titled "Letters to a Young Scientist," and basically it's a collection of essays that he wrote as on all the learning, all his lessons as an advisor over the years, basically. And then he's just talking to people, to students, right? Like the book is that. And one of the messages that stuck in my head so much, because I read it when I was doing my PhD, was that when it comes to science, walk away from the sound of the cannons. Because what he says is that if you are in a space that is already overcrowded, for you to excel or for you to be not noticeable, you have to excel so much. I mean, because the space is so crowded. You're just going to be one more doing what everybody else is doing. But if you find a place where you think you can make an important contribution, very quickly become established, because nobody else is looking at that, or probably it's a problem that is already there and everybody's seeing it, but it's the angle that you take to approach the problem. What he says is like, just go for it and just be very bold. Because yeah, that's what he says. A space that is already crowded, it's just very hard for you to be, you know, somebody prominent. But if you go to a place that is important, but nobody's looking at the problem the way you are thinking, you can be noticed very quickly, become visible very quickly. And that's going to be very good for your career.
I will say, like, there are like significant structural boundaries at times in places. At Florida, so Clara also had experience at University of Florida. So like at Florida, it was interesting because it's very interdisciplinary as well. The Center for Latin American Studies is a very, very interdisciplinary Center for Latin American Studies. So my career has been distinct insofar as that it's been like, I have a geography PhD, but my jobs have all been in interdisciplinary programs, which has been nice because you can do a lot of different things, but it also sometimes you feel like you're a little lost at times. So you kind of define it as you want to. But I've actually found the inverse here in our program much more constraining as far as expectations on like where to publish and like how. I think it's because it's a College of Natural Resources and like our program, the Latin American Studies program at Florida had like ecologists, musicologists, sociologists, geographers, you know, lots of different folks from lots of different backgrounds, biologists, all kinds of things. But it had more pathways for like, and a process to evaluate and think about the diversity of knowledge production and scholarship, that I actually think that our program, which is highly interdisciplinary, but is also quite constrained in what it considers as valued knowledge, right? So like a book doesn't count, that type of thing. Yeah, so it's interesting and it's a challenge, and you have to like be strategic and careful about like how you take on like challenging the power, because some folks will not abide by that, you know what I mean? So yeah, I think it's about like the timing and thinking, and I definitely agree with the perspectives on like finding like your community and building that community, and the like going deep and like gaining your strength and expertise in your area, and also like then figuring out the places where you can meaningfully like push back and like invoke change, you know. But you have to be strategic about like what you take on, because some of these things are very well established, and there will be resistance that might be more than is worth getting into at the time. Yeah.
Be bold.
Yeah. Anybody else have other questions?
Yeah, I've got a question.
Please.
So you referenced the need to change the goals in this interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work, and that has me thinking about a couple of things. And you also referenced the legwork of just like building up teams. In my PhD, I watched, I'm a hydrologist by training as well. I was connected to an Infuse grant, and I watched basically a $5 million grant build friendships and some disciplinary focus papers, and that's about it. And then like led to future collaboration. It was like, well, that $5 million was necessary, just like force people into the room. And then when the money ran out, they all went back to their labs and wrote their own papers. So like, that feels like a challenge that like, we've got these papers as incentive, that is a limitation. And on the other side of it, I was doing a lot of erosion work with farmers in a landscape that's been studied for 100 years. And we keep finding little science bubbles to write papers about. And the farmers keep doing what they do, better or worse. But we had no impact as scientists on the actual quality of the soil or the rate of erosion. Pay my check, right? Or rather, maybe there's an inverse incentive, you really pull it apart. So I'm interested in what you all think in terms of like, how do we change those goals? How do we write that into our funding structures to like enforce it upon ourselves? Or other things that you're thinking about when you say that?
Yeah, I'm interested in those answers too. I think, yeah, I personally think that that's, you know, a kind of persistent challenge, just like you said, it maybe took $5 million to kind of start the process. And like knowing that and maybe spreading awareness of kind of what it takes is the first step. And we're talking about kind of changing structures and aligning our kind of incentives with the processes. And I think it's just all kind of a slow moving machine. So I don't know if I have like answers of how that's going to happen. But I do think that it's important to, you know, if we really want to do this work, I mean, you could just say that we're doing this work and then still do what we were doing before. But if we really do want to do this work, we need to understand what it takes and try to write that into the grants and find funding sources that start to appreciate what it takes, and kind of just advance in the goalposts slowly, and have conversations like this to try to think of strategies for doing that, because I do think there's a, you know, a bit of alignment that needs to happen in order to, you know, maybe be more effective. I certainly understand when you're talking about kind of getting together and then going back and writing your own disciplinary based paper, and it goes to our expectations and our incentives and, you know. Anyone have solutions?
No, it's really, I mean, I think that's a huge issue, right? And like, when I was with the Earth Commission and we did write an interdisciplinary paper, it took years. And it took like all of us going to a hotel on the coast of the Netherlands in the off season and like hashing out things where nobody knew what anyone else was talking about. And that was a huge funder made that happen. So I think it's really hard. And also, I mean, you see at the Soil Carbon Solutions Center, everyone's like, we want to know the social science. And then the first thing to get cut is the 50 cents that we've been allotted of the $5 million budget. But now we have to save money, so get rid of that.
Well, nice, very nice talk. And
Everybody should introduce themselves real quick.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
and Hugo, I'm from Brazil, I'm visiting research at Japan. I did my PhD here 25 years ago, so it's a kind of came back, and it's nice to be here. My questions resemble what your point, but I think three really important points for science and for thinking is the question of power and democracy. That it was kind of very evident for us in Latin America and in Brazil under dictatorship and all the history that went through there. And it was nice when there is some more fresh air and for participation and more economic improvement. But also change, how to promote change, how to for erosion or carbon or biodiversity or water, whatever. How can we be involved in changing landscape, changing socioeconomical conditions of the communities? Most of the conservation, and I think in Latin America and by the results that we are seeing in this seminar, it goes to that, how to address power, how to address democracy, and how to address change. And there is so few work addressing change in any field. We need to publish, it's important. We need to do our work, and well, then we have next round, the next project, and have to catch up for things going on. But wherever we can promote some change, we can be effective in helping communities in some way that they are kind of getting more profitable than the traditional markets or cash crop production, they are likely to engage in conservation practice by different reasons, but particularly because they can get more quality of life, not necessarily income, but quality of life. And this something that's well, I've been thinking the last 30 years about that, how to work with that, how to be involved with that, and wherever there are opportunities for that, well, let's try to do that. But I can see not many works with that approach, how to promote change in communities, in the landscape, and I'm not writing about that, but doing some possibility, just raising the point and to see some thinking and to share this thinking about it with you.
That's a really hard question, I think. And even the scholarship doesn't always tell us the how. We know what needs to be done, but the how is really sort of place-based. And also like we saw what happened when Bolsonaro came in and then Bolsonaro left, right? The way that the environment was managed changed really quickly. I mean, I'm not a Latin American person, right? But I think, yeah, so I don't know. I share your questions.
Comment on that?
Yeah, I'm confronted with that every single class that I teach to undergrads on environmental governance, because I teach them, a lot of theory, and then I just share real world cases, right, of environmental governance, and then we do the readings, and the readings are all mostly empirical studies, right? And what they want is what you're saying. What they ask me is like, well, because we critique the paper, and then they summarize the paper, and then we have a discussion about the papers, and then they always go at the end. Most of them always the critique to the papers are always like, this is great, but they don't really tell us how we can fix the problem. What the how to. And I wonder, right, whether at the end of the day, we definitely need to integrate better with practitioners to produce that kind of knowledge, because we are in the business of understanding the world, right? Whether it's understanding processes or patterns or, explaining them, but not necessarily engineering. And I would say that probably conservation science, as a discipline, has moved much more into that space through a lot of so-called structural decision-making, resource allocation frameworks. That has to do a lot with the how-to. I think conservation as a discipline has moved much more. That to me, once you start moving much more into that space, to me, I would even question to what degree that's actually conservation science. To me, that's almost conservation engineering. The moment you are working prescriptively about how you allocate resources, that could have scientific underpinnings, but that's not real science, it's engineering, you are trying to accomplish something, you're not trying to explain the world, you are trying to accomplish something. And that to me is more akin of what you were saying. So I would say that, yeah, conservation has really moved towards that space, because people were tired of getting all these papers and nothing would happen on the ground. And like, well, how can we use science-informed processes to improve what is happening on the ground, how we are allocating resources, how we are managing protected endangered species. So yeah.
Maybe last question from Paul, just for the second.
Yeah, I have 2 minutes, so very briefly. Paul Cisneros is my name. I'm a research associate with Warner and also affiliated with the School of Global Environmental Sustainability. Been studying governance for a while, so I wanted to ask if you could offer some critiques to the governance approach. And I was thinking that for a long time, we've been, as governance scholars, promoting this idea of governance as a different way of achieving government that is more participatory, more horizontal. But sometimes I've been to the field doing research and doing some transdisciplinary work, and people say, we don't want to participate.
Yeah.
We don't have time for this. So then how much should we still promote this more normative or prescriptive vision of a type of governance, and how much should we pursue other forms of governance? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a great.
Sorry, it's probably another session.
No, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think we need to take a critical approach to even how we understand governance, right? And is it like, how are we managing the environment, or managing people, or sort of collectively managing? because with that fatigue that you're talking about, or sort of just valid disinterest
Right.
is totally, you know, it's real. And it's fine. It is what it is,
That's
sort
what
of.
it is, yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's a good question, but I definitely think we need to not just have one understanding of what governance is.
Mhm.
Yeah, so my take on that would be, yeah, that definitely I would go back to, you know, like going beyond panaceas, you know, at the end of the day, I mean, you gotta, I mean, if we are moving outside the, you know, trying to explain to trying to promote particular ways of doing, I would say that, yeah, I mean, you have just to, you know, we have to think about what works according to each context, I would say. Yeah, I don't think there is a one size, you know, fits all approach in that case, but yeah, but I would be very keen to keep talking after today.
I would love to go to like a weekend thought retreat and just mull over that question.
Maybe we could go on the off season and the Netherlands. I was like,
Yes.
that sounds like a pretty nice place to go think about some cool stuff.
Pretty nice.
That's really
yeah.
awesome, yeah.
Yeah, it was rough. It was a rough postdoc.
Yeah, totally. That sounds like it.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, thanks,
There is-
everybody.
there is a
Oh, there's
question.
Oh, is there one?
online.
Maybe last one online because folks are gonna have to.
Oh,
So, oh no, it was not a question, sorry. Emilia Roberta is just saying thanks for a great conversation.
Okay, awesome.
thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, great to meet you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us. This was
Yeah,
really fun.
sure. After spring break, we'll have, we'll continue the series, and then later in the semester, we have, as well, Jan de Porleng de Waro, coming from, McGill University's a geographer. Coming from McGill University, we'll have, several folks talking about gender as well and transdisciplinarity, and, yeah, we have seminars every week, so you're welcome to join if you want to. Or join online or check out the videos online. So, because we're now posting everything to YouTube. So, but thanks very much. I know you're all very busy and really appreciate you sharing some of your thoughts and thinking flexibly with us as well, in a somewhat unstructured space. So
There's not enough chances to
Yeah.
have conversations like this with people, and so I'm really grateful.
It's really nice, actually. I really like it personally, and
Yeah.
I'm grateful for y'all's time. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
How will I see?